Bertrand L. Comparet.
Tonight I want to talk about the tribe of Benjamin and what happened to them eventually. As you know, the entire 12 tribes were born of 4 different mothers, so they were not all full brothers. However, Joseph and Benjamin were full brothers, born of the same mother, Rachel. Benjamin's destiny appeared odd from the beginning. He was always, of course, the great favorite of his father, Jacob. And in Genesis 49, verse 27, when the aged Israel is on his deathbed in Egypt, and he's giving to each of his children his blessing, he says this about Benjamin. Benjamin shall raven as a wolf. In the morning he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil. Now that warlike blessing seemed a little bit odd, because at all times Benjamin was one of the smallest tribes in Israel. In the first chapter of Numbers, you note that the tribe of Benjamin had 35,400 warriors, and only one tribe, Manasseh, with 32,200, was smaller. The discrepancy became greater through the centuries as they went on to become a nation in their promised land. So here one of the smallest tribes yet had a warlike destiny. Moses, when he was reaching the end of his life and was telling the tribes what would become of them, in Deuteronomy 33, verse 12, Moses said of Benjamin, "The beloved of Yahweh shall dwell in safety by him, and Yahweh shall cover him all the day long, and he shall dwell between his shoulders." Some of the translations say Yahweh will carry him in his bosom. So anyway, there was a very special destiny for this small tribe of Benjamin. During the Exodus, when the people of Israel were on the march, as they set up their camp at night, they camped in the form of a hollow square. And on the west were 3 tribes. There are 3 tribes on each of the 4 sides, and on the west, these 3 were Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin. Ephraim was the leading tribe, and their banner flew to show where the headquarters was on the western side. But we might well expect, therefore, that the final gathering in of the tribes in their ultimate homeland might be in somewhat that same order. When they settled in Palestine, Benjamin had a narrow strip of territory between Judah on the south of them, Ephraim and Manasseh on the north of them, Dan on the west, and Reuben across the Jordan River to the east of them. And the city of Jerusalem lay right on the border between Benjamin and Judah. Well, they had a rather checkered career there. As the reading of the historical books of the Bible will show you, none of the tribes of Israel behaved themselves properly much of the time. They had their wicked men among them, and because then as now, it was always somebody else's business to curb the wicked. Don't disturb me with it. I'm too busy making money. Let somebody else take care of that. So the wicked flourished and became powerful and dangerous. It appears most particularly in Benjamin in one incident which is told in the last 3 chapters of the book of Judges, Judges 19, 20, and 21. A Levite had married a woman whose parents lived in Jerusalem and had taken her to his home city some distance away. She misbehaved herself very badly, was an adulteress, and finally left him and went home to her parents. And instead of offering up a prayer of thanksgiving to God for that, he went back to her parents' home to get her and take her back again. He stayed several days at the parents' home and then left late in the afternoon, which was always a mistake. Now, the larger cities generally had an inn where travelers could stay. The smaller towns did not. So they got just a few miles out of town to a little village within the territory of Benjamin, stopped for the night. An old man, evidently living alone, had no sons to defend his home, offered him hospitality for the night, so he and his wife went in there. Now, of course, in a little town, the arrival of a stranger is always the subject of local gossip, was then. So during the night, some of the ruffians of the town came and threatened to break in the door and kill the old man and his guest unless they were able to get at this Levite's wife. So, to save their lives, they pushed her out of the door into the street, and this gang of ruffians raped her all night until she died from her injuries. You remember that the Bible definitely commands the death penalty for a large number of crimes. And during those times when they enforced the law, why, crime just about disappeared. When the criminal disappears, so does crime. Well, the Levite cut up the corpse of his wife into a dozen pieces and sent a piece to the headquarters of each of the 12 tribes. That was something startling enough to cause them to ask questions. How could all this be? What had happened? So when the news got out, there was general indignation, and they demanded of the people of this village that they hand over the criminals for trial and, of course, execution. They refused to do it. And the other tribes then called up their military forces, and the whole 11 of them declared war on Benjamin. Well, it would have been much better for Benjamin to have handed over the criminals. So that's how it worked out. There was warfare between the one little tribe of Benjamin and the entire other 11 tribes of Israel. And indeed, for the first few days, Benjamin gave them a thorough whipping. Remember, Benjamin shall raven as a wolf, and he was starting to live up to that original prophecy. Nevertheless, the armies that outweighed them so much, outnumbered them so much, prevailed. And they had sworn, when Benjamin offered resistance, that they were going to absolutely exterminate the tribe of Benjamin. And with the exception of a group of about 600 of the warriors, who finally were able to flee away from the battlefield, the armies of Israel did just that. Every village they took, they slaughtered the aged and the women and the children and everybody. And then it finally dawned on them what they had accomplished in practically exterminating one of the 12 tribes. Now, they had also sworn, first of all, anyone of military age who did not come join the army for the war against Benjamin would be killed. Secondly, any man who gave his daughter in marriage to a Benjamite would be killed. Well, they had killed all but 600 of them who fled out into the wilderness. Now what? Then they began to sit down and weep and tear their hair and so on, because now the tribes were down to 11. No more Benjamin. What to do? Well, they finally found that there was one village from which no man had come to join the army of Israel to fight against Benjamin. Well, that offered a first idea. They were a pretty bloodthirsty lot in those days. They went to this village and they slaughtered its inhabitants, with the exception that they found 400 young women of marriageable age and unmarried. They saved those alive and cut the throats of the rest of them. So they sent messengers out to where the Benjamites had found a place where they could fight for their lives, finally, out in the wilderness. And they said, well, it's all over. We aren't mad anymore. And we have gotten 400 women here for you for wives. But there were 600 of these warriors. Problem still wasn't solved. But with the typical ancient Oriental ideas, they had a scheme for that. They didn't want to violate their oath, that nobody would voluntarily give his daughter as a wife to a Benjamite. But they said, well, there's a city not far away from here, pretty good size, and in the next few days, they're going to have a festival. And as part of the celebration, they come out in the fields and dance and sing and so on. Now, the 200 of you who have no wives, you go hide in the brush at the edge of that field. And when you see the young women from this village out there dancing and singing in the field in their celebration, why, you rush in and kidnap some wives, which they did. Of course, the parents whose daughters had been kidnapped felt a bit annoyed at that, but the rest of Israel calmed them down, explained why they had to do this, because nobody wanted to violate his oath, and particularly get his throat cut for it. So finally, everybody was happy except the much greater part of the tribe of Benjamin that had been massacred. Well, that was rough treatment, but it did serve to purge the tribe. Now, on something of this sort, you may be sure that God had a hand in it. If the tribe was going to be almost exterminated, he would be on hand to see that the better ones were the ones who survived, and that the worst of them would be among those who perished on the battlefield. So, from this time on, evidently, they were a much better influence. In the 6th chapter of Jeremiah 6, verse 1, with no particular reason for it apparent at the time, the prophet Jeremiah gives a special warning to the tribe of Benjamin, singling them out by name. O ye children of Benjamin, gather yourselves to flee out of the midst of Jerusalem, and blow the trumpet in Tekoa, and set up a sign of fire in Beth-Haccherem. For calamity appears out of the north, and great destruction. Well, the time for that was still in the indefinite future. But there was a time when the point of it became apparent, as we shall see. You remember that the first invasion and conquest came to the northern kingdom of Israel. Between 740 and 721 B.C., all those being years of constant fighting, the vast armies of Assyria gradually conquered all of the northern kingdom and deported their men and settled them in what came later to be called Scythia, around the southern end of the Caspian Sea. Now, the geography of Palestine is worthy of note here for a moment. If you set it down in southern California, it would extend from the Mexican border to the southerly part of Los Angeles, and inland from the sea it wouldn't be wider than 40 miles at any point. Now divide that into 3 roughly equal portions. The southerly third was that of the entire kingdom of Judah, made up of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. The northerly 2/3 of that area was that of the 10-tribed kingdom of Israel. When the Assyrians conquered it, the Bible is very careful to point out that the southerly part of the territory of Israel, the middle third of the entire Palestinian area, Samaria, was the one that they repopulated with other people. The northerly portion, Galilee, they left vacant. You find it in 2 Kings 17, verse 24. And the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon, and from Cusa, and from Ava, and from Hamath, and from Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria, instead of the children of Israel. And they possessed Samaria, and dwelt in the cities thereof. So now, of these three portions of Palestine, the southerly third was still occupied by the kingdom of Judah. The middle third was occupied by the people that the Assyrians had settled there in place of the deported Israelites, and the northerly third, Galilee, was left vacant. A bit over a century later, Babylon conquered the southern kingdom of Judah and deported them for 70 years to the territory right around Babylon. While they were gone, the Edomites, a most pestilential people from their beginning, the Edomites were driven out of their territory up to that time, Mount Seir, a very rugged mountain range southeast of the Dead Sea. They were driven out by an invasion of an Arabian people, the Nabateans. And they couldn't go southwest. That would take them into the territory of Egypt, and they weren't big enough to pick any quarrel with Egypt. If they went straight west into the southerly portion of the vacant territory which Judah had occupied, there were very few people left there, so no resistance could be made. And they did settle there. Well, now remember, the entire territory of the southerly kingdom of Judah wasn't more than perhaps 40 miles from north to south. And the southerly half of that was now taken up by the Edomites. So when the little group came back from Babylon, some Benjamites, some Judahites, and some mongrel mixture, and some Babylonians, they didn't have much land in which to spread out. Remember, originally, the territory of the tribe of Judah had been on the south, and the territory of the tribe of Benjamin on the north. So they sorted themselves out in roughly that same order. Some few Benjamites were able to stay in the old territory of Judea, but the bulk of them were pushed out. Now, they couldn't just move back one step into Samaria. That was thoroughly occupied. They had to leapfrog over into Galilee, up in the north, around the Sea of Galilee, because that was vacant. So in Jesus Christ's time, Galilee was populated almost exclusively by Benjamites. Judea and the capital city of Jerusalem had some, not many out of the relatively big population total, some Judahites, a little handful of Benjamites, a lot of Edomites, and a general mixture of the Canaanites of the vicinity, which the people of Israel had been commanded by God to exterminate, and they failed to do it. Then, of course, since Palestine was, then even more than now, the crossroads of the world, you had, of course, some mixture of Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, Syrians, Babylonians, and whatever came along. Now, Jesus Christ's hometown, Nazareth, was in Galilee. It was just north of the valley of Megiddo, where there is yet to be a great battle. It was a few miles southwest of the Sea of Galilee. Now, you remember that he made most of his converts up in Galilee. Bible in one place says he could not walk in Jewry, for the Jews sought to kill him. So he went back home to Galilee. Another one, Matthew 13, verses 53 to 54. And it came to pass that when Jesus had finished these parables, he departed thence. And when he was come into his own country, you know, they recognized Galilee as his own country, he taught them in their synagogue, insomuch that they were astonished, and said, Whence hath this man this wisdom and these mighty works? To what extent any of this was a hangover from the old days, I don't know. But the Galileans, the Benjamites up there, developed a distinctive dialect of their own. Now, they were speaking Aramaic, but they spoke it with an accent of their own. You have no difficulty in recognizing a Cockney Englishman by his speech. And similarly, they had no difficulty at all in recognizing a Galilean. Always there had been a difference in accent or dialect between the northern kingdom and the southern one. You remember in Judges 12, verses 5 and 6, Ephraim had invaded the territory below it and been thoroughly licked in the resulting battle. They'd attacked the city of Gilead, and the army of Gilead, trying to catch the stragglers, seized the fords over the river Jordan. And this says, And the Gileadites took the passages of Jordan before the Ephraimites. And it was so that when those Ephraimites which were escaped said, Let me go over, that the men of Gilead said unto him, Art thou an Ephraimite? If he said, Nay, then said they unto him, Now say Shibboleth, word that meant a stream. And he said Sibboleth, for he could not frame to pronounce it right. In other words, the same letter that was pronounced like the letter S in the northern kingdom of Israel was pronounced like SH in the kingdom of Judah. Now, with one exception, all of Jesus Christ's disciples were Galileans, Benjamites. The only exception was Judas, who betrayed him. All the Bible names are badly mangled in trying to transliterate them into Greek in the New Testament. You note when you read it, it never speaks of the prophet Jeremiah. It calls him Jeremy, or I think in one place Jeremiah with an S on the end of it instead of an H. And Isaiah becomes Isaiah, and so forth. Well, there is no such word in any language known to mankind as Iscariot. That was garbled up. Judas Iscariot. Judas, or Judah, the man of Carios. Carios was a little village down in the southwestern portion of the old territory of Judah, by then occupied by the Edomites. So Judas was an Edomite Jew, and he was the only Jew among the apostles. And, of course, he behaved like it. You remember that when Jesus was arrested the night of his betrayal and taken to the home of the high priest, and Peter followed him, and he pretty near got into difficulties himself, because as a Galilean he spoke with that accent. Luke 22, verse 59. And about the space of 1 hour after, another confidently affirmed, saying, Of a truth, this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean. They could recognize him. Mark 14, verse 70. And he denied it again. And a little after, they that stood by said again to Peter, Surely thou art one of them, for thou art a Galilean, and thy speech agreeth thereto. And you find it noted again at the day of Pentecost. Acts 2, chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. And when the day of Pentecost was fully come, they were all with one accord in one place. Now, by now, Judas Iscariot was dead. But the other 11 apostles were there, and they had also chosen a man to take the place of Judas. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak with other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. Now when this was noised abroad, the multitude came together and were confounded, because that every man heard them speak in his own language. And they were all amazed, saying to one another, Behold, are not all these which speak Galileans? So there are your 11 other apostles, every one known to be a Galilean. Well, as I reminded you, the prophet Jeremiah, way back a little before 600 BC, gave them that warning. O ye children of Benjamin, gather yourselves to flee out of the midst of Jerusalem. For calamity appears out of the north and great destruction. Jesus Christ gave them another specific warning, and the fact that the Benjamites were by this time practically all Christians made his warning effective. No Jew was going to believe anything that Jesus Christ said. So he could safely give this warning without sparing any of the Jews. But the Christians believed him, and he saved their lives by it. It's in the 21st chapter of Luke, verse 20. You remember that the disciples had been commenting with some awe upon the magnificence of the great stone temple that Herod had built. And Jesus said, well, the time is coming when there won't be one stone of this left upon another. And the disciples said, well, what will be the sign of this? Or when will this be, rather? And what is the sign of thy coming, the end of this age? So he told them, first of all, he answered their first question, when is this going to be, if the temple will be torn down? He said, when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed, that is, encircled, with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. And he went on to give them then the answer to their second question, what would be the signs of his return? The historian Josephus gives us in detail the fulfillment of this. Josephus, Wars of the Jews, Book 4, Chapter 9, 9 through 11, and Book 5, first several chapters. Vespasian, the father of Titus, was the Roman general in command of the Roman armies in Palestine. And the Romans by this time were fed up with the rascality of these Jews, and they determined to put an end to it. So Vespasian got his army together, and marching through the country, first clearing up the rest of the country where the little villages weren't able to make any particular resistance. And of course the Jews fled before him out of their villages into the great fortified city of Jerusalem. So in the year 68 A.D., Vespasian swept the country with his army and finally came to Jerusalem, much too well fortified to simply take by storm. So he put his army around it to start a siege and starve them out. Josephus tells about it. And now the war, having gone through all the mountainous country and all the plain country also, those that were at Jerusalem were deprived of the liberty of going out of the city. For, as to such as had a mind to desert, they were watched by the zealous. And as to such as were not yet on the side of the Romans, their army kept them in by encompassing the city round about on all sides. Well, here were some Benjamites, of course, cooped up in Jerusalem with the rest of them. But Nero, the Roman emperor, died. And by this time, the Roman armies were making and unmaking emperors. Now, Vespasian actually had a better right to the throne than any of those that were on hand to claim it. He was at least as near related in the royal family, and certainly he had the ability which the others had not shown. So the army told Vespasian, look, we don't want some incompetent fool back there made emperor. You go back to Rome and get this thing settled. The army back there will certainly rally to your support, and they'll make you emperor. So he did so. Josephus tells this in the latter part of Book 4. He pulled his armies out of the siege of Jerusalem, went back to the seacoast, and himself took ship for Rome. Now, remember, no Jew was willing to believe Christ's warning. The Christians, which means the handful of true Judahites down in Judah and the Benjamites from Galilee, they said, just exactly what Christ warned us of. And so they fled. Because the Roman armies being withdrawn, anybody could go in or out of the city as he pleased. The next year, A.D. 69, Vespasian's son Titus, now in command of the Roman armies, resumed the siege, which lasted about a year. The city became, first of all, their forces were decimated from inside. They had taken in the Edomites, who had come there to help defend it. And then they had their own faction of the Zealots, and these became nothing more than bandits, not only killing anybody they suspected of not wanting to follow their political plans, but also killing anybody they suspected of having something worth stealing. Then pestilence broke out among them, and famine, and over 1 million people died in the siege. So Titus finally took the city and dragged the rest of them, the survivors, off to slavery or drove them out of the country. Well, the Benjamites, having taken the hint and gotten out, they fled across the Jordan River through the kingdom of Herod Agrippa on north into Asia Minor, what today is Turkey. Now, where to go? They couldn't go into Africa. They couldn't go to Greece or Italy, France, nor Spain. Those were all parts of the Roman Empire, and they would undoubtedly be arrested and sold into slavery as being fugitive rebel Jews. Some of them stayed put in the northern part of Asia Minor along the Black Sea coast in Cappadocia and a little area in there called Galatia. St. Paul's epistle to the Galatians was not written to those who were in Asia Minor. Galatia is the Greek form of Gaul, and it was written to the Christians who were in Gaul, which today is France. But anyway, there was a dinky little territory down in Asia Minor, also called Galatia. A few of them stayed there. Now, if they were going to leave Scandinavia, northern Britain, and Ireland were the only places that they could, or Germany, of course, that they could flee to for refuge, which were outside the Roman Empire. Those who stayed in Cappadocia in Asia Minor remained there until the year 267 A.D. The Goths sent a powerful army in there in a raid at that time, and they carried off the Christians into Europe. Now, those Benjamite Christians they picked up there were settled among the Dacian Goths in the Danube Valley and became Christian missionaries. Now, that was 287 A.D. And within the next half century, more than half of the Goths had already been converted to Christianity by these Benjamite missionaries. When the kingdom originally broke up into Israel and Judah, You remember God said that he was going to leave one extra tribe to the house of David, that they might always have a light before them. He left them the tribe of Benjamin. And the destiny of Benjamin from then on was to be the light bearers, and you can see how they did it. Trying in vain to furnish a good influence upon the southern kingdom, David was a reasonably good king. Solomon began as such. They had one other, Hezekiah, and for the rest they were as fine a collection of scoundrels as you could find unhung. So the house of David didn't live up to the expectations. The tribe of Benjamin were the light carriers in Christ's time when they furnished most of his converts and 11 of his apostles. Now they were becoming the light carriers, converting the Goths, the people of Scythian Israel in Europe. We do know that they eventually arrived in Scandinavia and from there scattered somewhat. Now you'll run across people who like to show off some mock learning and tell you they can identify all 12 of the tribes today, and it's pure imagination. You can, I would say with substantial certainty, identify the tribe of Benjamin and the tribe of Dan. You've got good reason for identifying the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, and beyond that you go into a field of pure guesswork. You remember this prediction about Benjamin was, he shall raven as a wolf. And they took the wolf as their emblem. The banner of Benjamin had a wolf on it. And you can trace them by that. If you see a band of troops marching today carrying the American flag and wearing the American Army uniform, you have pretty good reason to believe they're American soldiers. And when you find the people who are part of the Israel migration and carrying a banner which was not the flag of any of the other tribes, you've got pretty good reason for believing that thereby you trace the tribe of Benjamin, who did have that for their flag. Early records show that from their place in Asia Minor, right on the southern seashore of the Black Sea, quite a number of them sailed by ship, went through the Mediterranean, out the Straits of Gibraltar, on up the west coast of Europe, and landed in Scandinavia. They settled along the fjords of the North Sea coast of Norway. They were even then carrying the wolf banner. That was the quickest, the easiest route, and part of them went there. Part came with the Israel migration up the Danube Valley and across Germany to the Baltic Sea. The leader of one great part of that migration to Scandinavia was Odin. He was later deified among the Scandinavians as Odin. Among the Germans, they changed the name a little bit and made it Vodin or Wotan. But he is a very definite historical character, not mythology at all. He was their leader. He took them from, what is now extreme southwestern Russia, on up the Danube Valley, across Germany to the shores of the Baltic, and on across into Sweden. And incidentally, the genealogy of the family of George Washington has been traced, and Odin is one of his ancestors. Also, he is an ancestor of a good many of the European kings. On the march, he appears to have been a combination Moses and Aaron. He was their military leader, their judge, their lawmaker, and again he served as high priest, assisted by 12 assistant priests. He made his final home in Sweden, and there he died. Thor, by the way, who also was deified as the god of thunder and of justice, was another historical character on that march, and probably a son of Odin, anyway a close relative, and probably a son. The people that he led, they called themselves the Asar, which may have been simply what the southern tribes would have called Asher. You remember one of the 12 tribes? Anyway, history records they were big men, blonde and blue-eyed, and terrible warriors. Their Norse runic writing shows that their language was Aryan, derived from the Phoenician, and the Phoenician was the language of ancient Israel. What passes for Hebrew, written Hebrew today, was unknown by any man on earth prior to the Babylonian captivity. It appears that they attempted to more or less copy the appearance of the cuneiform writing used by the Babylonians. But because specimens of it have been found of ancient date, it is known that the written Hebrew before the deportations used what has been called the Phoenician alphabet, and which is very, very ancient. You know, you're told that most of our European languages are descended from the Sanskrit, but the fact is that the Phoenician is the earlier language from which the Sanskrit was derived, and it very probably is the language that the Adamites brought when they began migrating out of the place in Western Asia to which Adam went when he was driven out of the Garden of Eden. There's difficulty in getting complete enough records on some of these things because you had nobody for many centuries undertaking to keep a complete world history, and the historical records of each city that was conquered were pretty much lost. And the historical records of each city that was conquered were pretty much lost because the conquered city was always burned by its enemies. It's only when modern archaeologists poking around, digging out the ruins, begin finding some of these records, we can start piecing this thing together. So, here you had the people known to be Israelites, known to be big, blonde, blue-eyed men and terrible warriors, and on the march to their new homeland, carrying the wolf banner of Benjamin. Way back before the time of the Exodus from Egypt, some of the people of Israel had gone out of Egypt without waiting for the Exodus. Part of them were the Zara half of the tribe of Judah. Not all of the Zara half, but a substantial portion of them. Part of them belonged to the tribe of Dan. They went up the east coast of the Mediterranean. The Greek historians record the coming of the Danoi from Egypt, but not Egyptian and settling in portions of Greece. They settled a number of cities on the seacoast of what today would be Turkey, Asia Minor, including the important city of Miletus. You had those already in that position where they could be more or less of a stepping stone for the people fleeing after the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. Earlier than that, when the tribes were still in Scythia, as I say, their runic alphabet was derived from this old Phoenician alphabet. Now, you know what our Roman letter A looks like now, a capital A. But you take that letter and tip it over to the left on the side. It's a tip-down V with a bar across it, and that was the old Phoenician or Sanskrit form of it. Among the Semitic peoples, they called it Aleph, and farther east, it was called Asa or Ace. It was the first letter of the alphabet. It had a value of 1, and we still call the card, which has only one spot on it, the Ace. And what it represented was the head of a bull, nose widening back to the ears, and then those two horns. It was associated, of course, with the sign Taurus, the bull, in the stars. And the bull was the emblem of the tribe of Ephraim. Now, the early Vikings, they were not the only people who did it, but it was characteristic of them. These Vikings had helmets with bull horns on them. They were an Israelite people. They were the first of those going on up into Europe, the earliest, having to flee up into there to go that far. And they got it from this letter, Aleph or Asa, representing the bull with those horns. You remember, too, the prophecy about Ephraim, that with his horns he would push the other nations around. It was part of the language, the idiom of the language, that the horns of an animal were emblems of power, and so used. Well, these people who were tall, blond, blue-eyed, terrible fighters, marching under the wolf's banner, finally settled in the Scandinavian peninsula, to a little extent in North Germany and some in Denmark, but the bulk of their settlement was north of the Baltic in the Scandinavian peninsula. Sweden occupies the easterly side of the Scandinavian peninsula. It faces entirely on the Baltic Sea. And Sweden's interests were, of course, largely governed by that. The Swedes were a very terrible nation in those days. In our time, they're as peaceable as anybody you can find. But these big warriors had our people's restless urge to get out and see what's going on elsewhere and not to let anybody stand in their way. They first began exploring western Russia. They traveled through its rivers, the Volga, and on till they came to the Don and Dnieper and followed those down to the Black Sea and set up trade routes from the Baltic clear down to Constantinople. Then, instead of trying to run trade through hostile country, they simply conquered western Russia. And one of their chieftains, Rurik, set up a Swedish kingdom which lasted several centuries in western Russia. Of course, they weren't big enough to withstand indefinitely the Slavic push in there that finally overwhelmed them by sheer numbers. Denmark, of course, juts out a little from the south shore of the Baltic. It has a Baltic sea coast and a North Sea coast, and their interests are somewhat divided. But the Norwegians, living along the westerly slope of the Scandinavian peninsula, had nothing to look to but the North Sea. Any Norwegian who missed his footing found himself in the North Sea right now. That was mountainous country. It had very little arable land. They couldn't turn farmer and make a living on that. There just wasn't enough land to support them, and there was too short a growing season. They were forced to look to the sea for survival. And from there came the terrible Vikings. Their Viking ships are among the most beautiful examples of ship design in all world history. Ancient ships in general, the ships of the Mediterranean people, were extremely clumsy. They would float, they could carry some things, they were poorly made. If they got into rough weather, they had to take heavy ropes and pass them around the ship. Get somebody to swim under the ship and carry it there, so that several places in the length of the ship, they had these ropes around it to hold it together, or it would come apart in rough weather. The Apostle Paul, in the book of Acts, talking about his journey to Rome, tells how their ship got into rough water and had to be undergirded to keep it from coming apart. That was not true of the Viking ships. A great Viking chieftain, when he died, would be buried in his ship, and a great burial mound heaped over it. And three of those, going back to about 900 A.D., had been found and dug up, and their lines are beautiful. An exact copy of one of them, dating from about 900 A.D., an exact copy was made. Of course, wood that's 1,000 years old and been buried 1,000 years in the ground couldn't stand the strain of going out to sea. So they built a new ship of fresh wood, but they made an exact copy of it. It would carry about a 32-ton load, and in 1893, I believe the date was, this ship was made and was sailed from Scandinavia to the United States. And it made the journey beautifully. And the crew commented upon how extremely seaworthy it was and how well it handled. So these Viking raiders set out, and they really were going places. They landed for piratical raids along the seacoast of France and Spain. They even entered the Tiber River and made an unsuccessful attack on the city of Rome. It was too heavily fortified for them to capture it, so they had to give it up. Some Viking ships even showed up in the harbor at Constantinople. And Normans, who were of pure Norse Viking ancestry, Norman raiders established colonies in southern Italy and Sicily in the 11th century A.D. They made the mistake of intermarrying with the local population after a time, and they were absorbed and their greatness vanished. There were several generations of raids on France. 3 different times they captured and looted the city of Paris. And finally, King Charles III of France gave the coastal province, the English Channel Coast province of Normandy, to a Norse chieftain. Some writers give his name as Rollo, some call him Rolf. This was in 911 A.D., and that very fine country, beautiful farming country, that was ceded to these Norse Vikings on condition that they would settle there and be a buffer against any further raids from the other Vikings, and they did so. Now from there came the Normans, who came into England under William the Conqueror in 1066. They were not Latin French at all. They were Norse Vikings. They had lived in France from 911 until 1066. They had picked up a somewhat modified form of the French language, but they were blonde, blue-eyed Norse Vikings. They carried the wolf banner when they went in, and of the noble families of England who are descended from those men who came in under William the Conqueror, a great many of them still have the wolf in their coat of arms. Well, in the early 800s in Norway, King Harold Fairhair was a harsh tyrant, and these freedom-loving Norsemen didn't intend to put up with that. One historian records that when some of these Norse Vikings were met on a more peaceful occasion, they were asked, "Who is your leader?" They proudly said, "We are all equal." And they weren't going to be tyrannized over by any man. And that's been their principle from the beginning. So with tyranny at home, they saw the futility of slaughtering each other in civil war at home. So out they spread, beginning now with, the late 700s, around 790 or so, in the early 800s AD, began these terrible Viking raids. First of all, they moved out and they settled the islands around the coast of Scotland, and even on the westerly coast of Scotland. The Scotch were not able to fight them off there, and they made a number of landings, not just as piratical raids, but as seizing territory in which they could live. And their settlers remained there. So even today, the Scotch are partly Norse. They made some landings on the coast of Ireland and set up quite a few colonies in Ireland. Then some of them, heading for these islands in the northern part of Scotland, were blown off course by storms considerably to the west, and they came to Iceland and Greenland. Now, Irish monks had tried to colonize the island of Iceland. It's just south of the Arctic Circle and about 600 miles west of Norway. And they had their little Irish colony there. But between 850 and 870 A.D., Norse colonists came in and drove them out. We still have the record of these Norse colonists, some 400 settlers, nearly all from western Norway, some from the Norse colonies already established in Ireland and the northern Scottish islands. There were a very few Swedes among them. There were no Danes. In 986 A.D., Bjarni Herlofsson, one of these Viking chieftains, sailed from Ireland, heading for Greenland, which lay still further to the north. And he was blown off course, sailed through storms for several days, and found himself sailing along the coast of a full-scale continent, much bigger than Greenland. It was the North American continent. But after sailing along the coast for several days, it didn't look good to him. He didn't land, and he got back and reported it. That was 986 A.D. So Leif Erikson bought Bjarni's ship, and he sailed from Greenland in 992 A.D. with a party of 35 men. He was going to get a look at this new continent. Well, he first found barren country. He called it Helluland, stone land. It was glacier country surrounded by cold, ice-filled waters, the soil pretty much carried off by glaciers, just boulders and ice. It wasn't worth landing on. He kept on going. Later, he passed the coast of flat, forested land, getting farther south, which he called Markland, forest land. Finally, they found an island, and behind it the mouth of a river, with good timber available, lots of fish, winter climate relatively mild, not a great deal of frost. He spent the winter there, and he commented that day and night were much nearer equal in length than they were up in Iceland or Greenland, as he was accustomed to. We know definitely it couldn't have been north of Chesapeake Bay from his description of it. Now, they found grapevines growing there, cut some samples which they took back with them. They called the place Vinland, wine land, and they sailed back home to Greenland. This was 500 years before Columbus. Now, Columbus possibly had some Jew blood in him. He was certainly financed with Jew money, and he got the Jew advertising. But the discovery of this continent was made by some of your brother Israelites, not Jews, 500 years before Columbus. The next year, Thorvald Eriksson, Leif's brother, took the same ship and went back. He found traces of the original landing. Their ship had been damaged. They had to cut out most of the keel and replace it with new timber. And they set up on a headland, they set up the keel of the old ship as a monument. And when Thorvald Eriksson went back, he found on this headland the keel of the old ship there. He was greatly pleased with the country and wanted to settle, but he was killed by hostile Indians, and the party went home next spring. Later, there was another expedition under Thorfinn Karlsefni. They liked the country, but there were too many attacks by hostile Indians, so they gave it up. Well, here they were, settled in Norway, which was too small, too rugged to support them. Forced to move out and look for other territory. As I said, they had made some landings on the west coast of Scotland. They had colonized the islands around the northerly part of Scotland. They had made landings in Ireland. The history of Ireland shows there were many Norwegian invasions from the year 807 onward, which resulted in many Norse settlements in Ireland. The Shetlands, Orkneys, and Hebrides around Scotland, settled by Norse Vikings. Down in England proper, Northumbria was again settled by Vikings. South of that, you had the big Danish settlement. The Danes had come in there. You remember these Norse and Danish raids on the coast of England were so terrible that the Britons couldn't beat them off. And so they invited the Jutes, Angles, and Saxons to come in and settle. And they settled really in the southerly part of Britain, starting with the Channel coast and working west from there, right on up to Wales. But next to them to the north, the territory was taken by the Danes. You had quite an extensive country, which had been taken over so completely by Danes They had their own system of law, their own kings and so forth. And the Saxons called this territory the Danelaw, because that's what it was, the country ruled by Danish kings and Danish law. North of the Thames River, as far as Chester, and to the east of a line roughly the same as the old Roman road, Watling Street, that was the Danelaw. It covered parts of Mercia and East Anglia. And these Danish Vikings had settled down as farmers. Incidentally, wherever you find in England village names ending in Thorpe or ending in the letters D-Y, Thorsby, Rigby, and so on, those show that it's an old Norse or Danish village. What can you do with these people who say, oh, all 12 tribes, you can identify this nation as this one and that the other? You can say this: Norway is evidently pure Benjamin. They never were overrun after they landed there, never were overrun by hostile other forces. And certainly when these terrible warriors originally took the Scandinavian country, they thoroughly exterminated any traces of settlement they may have found there. The Swedes likewise were not overrun. So you can say that those two countries have a pure Israelite stock, and that's all there is there, and except such travelers as have gone in our own time. Now when you come to Scotland, we know from their own historical records that today's Scotch are part North. We know that today's Irish are part North. We know that portions of England, while they have some identifying marks for the country as a whole, as the tribe of Ephraim, yet settled among them are a good many of these Norse and Danish Vikings, of the tribes of Benjamin and Dan. So when somebody tries to get very, very learned and point out to you where all 12 tribes are, don't let him kid you. He ought to know better. Now, among these people who had settled on the continent of Europe, some of them keep cropping up later. You remember that those who traveled by sea were relatively few. The great mass migration came by land. You had the Gothic tribes spending their first tremendous momentum driving clear through to the southern shores of the Baltic. Their rear guard began to be pushed westward by an invasion of the Huns, and first you had the Visigoths, the West Goths, turned westwardly so that they went first into Italy, conquered and looted the city of Rome in the year 410 A.D., in another 3 or 4 years moved out, crossed southern France and the Pyrenees, went into Spain and Portugal where they settled, and they were the dominant ruling people there, clear up into the time of the Moorish conquest in 711 A.D., when they lost political control. You find in southern Spain today a very mixed people, partly the old original stock, partly traces of Moorish blood. You find in northern Spain a less mixed people, and you find in the Spanish aristocracy, and this is true of Portugal likewise, some of the old Visigoth blood pretty well preserved. The Ostrogoths, after getting clear up into northern Germany, turned back. And they came back in here about 50 years after the Visigoth invasion. Not all of them turned back. Remember that you've had the Goths settling eastern Germany and going on into Sweden. A portion of Sweden is even to this day called Gothland. But you had some of them coming back and going into northern Italy, again defeating Rome and setting up a Gothic kingdom in northern Italy, which held political power for some 25, 30 years or so before they were overthrown. In southern Italy, you find traces of the old Mediterranean racial stock, much mixed with African and Asiatic peoples who'd come in as slaves, and racially in no way related to any of the Israel people. And then as you get on up into northern Italy, you find people who are Italians by geography and nationality, and in no way related by race to the southern Italians. You'll find big, fair-haired, blue-eyed North Italians who are definitely the old Ostrogoths. Now, others of them settled along the coastland. The city of Venice unquestionably was populated largely by them. And you remember that the city of Venice became practically a world power in its day. Wherever these people settled, they became the dominant ruling race. Then portions of Switzerland were settled by them. And over the line into Austria, you had people of this same racial stock. On into Hungary, likewise. Although the Hungarians came in much later, they had been laggards in the migration, had stayed behind in western Russia until finally the Mongolian invasions pushed them westward later. So you had here these independent people. They didn't take the political tyranny and they didn't take the religious tyranny. And it didn't take them too great a time to become fed up with the Catholic Church. And in there, Geneva was one of the important centers of the beginning of Protestantism. That's where Calvin got his start, and from him the Presbyterian Church of today. Then, of course, in Germany you had Martin Luther. Portions of this same stock in France began showing the typical racial trait. Remember that the only form of government known then was despotism of the worst sort. Drunken, incompetent, murderous kings who looked upon a nation only as something to be looted for his own profit, so he'd have plenty of money to spend on gambling and dissipation and that sort of thing. And these people didn't care much for that. And when in the matter of religion, they were told that the Pope had superseded God, and they were to take their orders from him hereafter, that didn't get down either. So, about the year 1560, a number of these people who were rebelling against Catholicism were given as a nickname this title of the Huguenots. The name Protestant wasn't applied to them for a century and a half longer. To begin with, they followed Calvin's reform in Geneva. The First National Synod of France in 1559 set up a church with the Calvinist doctrines of predestination and the grace of God, and particularly insisting upon the ceremonies of baptism and the Lord's Supper. They set up the Presbyterian form of church government. They weren't governed by cardinals and bishops sent out by Rome. They were governed by a council of presbyters or elders. They followed Calvin's doctrine that salvation cannot be earned by paying a lot of money to the Catholic Church, nor even by doing various works of penitence, such as wearing a hair shirt. Salvation comes purely as the gift of God. It is given by the grace of God to those whom he knows are proper to give it to, predestined for that. That to the extent they show good works, it is the fruit of their salvation by the grace of God. And a man who does not have that and simply tries to climb into heaven on his own efforts isn't going to get there. It just isn't that good. Well, they met heavy persecution from the start. Remember, these were the same kind of people as those Vikings who said, we don't have any leader, we're all equal. And the kings looked upon them with a bitterly prejudiced eye. And of course the Catholic Church set out from the beginning to exterminate them. The wars of religion that raged through there, 1562 to 1598, took many, many scores of thousands of lives. In France, they were finally promised religious toleration. Catholicism was still the official religion. Church and state worked together in harmony, but they were promised that they could have their own church and worship in their own way, provided, of course, they were peaceable and didn't try to set up their own kingdom. But there was conspiracy going on between the church and the weak and dissolute kings. And so by a conspiracy with the Catholic Church, the king, without releasing the news to anybody but the Catholics, withdrew the Edict of Toleration and made it lawful for anyone to murder a heretic and steal whatever he might have. So, without any warning at all, on St. Bartholomew's Eve in 1572, the Catholics suddenly fell upon these unsuspecting Protestants. Man walking down the street, having no idea that there was going to be any trouble at all, would be suddenly stabbed by some passing Catholic. And you had between 70,000 and 100,000 of these Huguenots were murdered. 20,000 of them, at least, in the city of Paris alone. Some of them left France after that, though the bulk of them remained. Finally, a Protestant king came to the throne, Henry IV. A very weak, irresolute man, but vaguely well-meaning. And he issued in 1598 the Edict of Nantes for religious tolerance. But nevertheless, through that period, you had the notorious Cardinal Richelieu at work, steadily scheming to get all these heretics murdered and the power of the church enforced again over every man in France. So in 1685, this Edict of Nantes was revoked, and massacres of the Protestants were renewed, besides which another device was tried. In those days, the army generally didn't have its own barracks. When they moved an army into a city, they billeted the soldiers, a few here and a few there, in the houses of the population. So this was done, billeting the soldiers in the homes only of the Protestants, and the soldiers were told, now go ahead, rape, rob, murder, do anything you please. There's no limit. You're not going to be questioned for what you do. So the result was that the Protestants got up and fled in a body. Some provinces of France were left practically depopulated when they moved out. And France was brought substantially to ruin by it, because her most industrious and best people were gone all in a body. Now, some of them fled into Germany, some into Switzerland, others into Holland and England, my own. Here you have the people of the tribes of Israel in their homes in Europe, which they had first taken up. Remember now that they went to Scythia, they settled there and became pretty comfortable, and that wasn't where they were to stay. So the Medo-Persian Empire was allowed to threaten them till they moved on out. They got into Europe, but that wasn't the final place for all of them, and some of them were driven out of there by these circumstances. Now look at England. You have original Jutes, Angles, and Saxons. The Jutes, undoubtedly, of the tribe of Judah. The Angles and Saxons, no doubt representing two tribes, which we can't really identify as to what they originally were before they got the Angles and Saxons name. You have the Danish and Norse Vikings settling there, and then later you have these Norse Vikings from the province of Normandy in France coming in there. And of course you still had a few of the old British left. The people of Wales still call themselves in their own language to this day Cymru. And you remember the Assyrian inscriptions stating that they had taken Beth Cymru, the house of Cymru, and deported it to the cities of the Medes. Now Cymru was the Assyrian form of Omri. You remember that one of the kings of the northern kingdom of Israel was Omri. A wicked scoundrel, but at least an able one. And because of his ability in running the nation, the Assyrians began calling the northern kingdom of Israel the house of Omri. Remember how the Bible talks about the house of David running the southerly kingdom of Judah. So, the Welsh definitely were of this Cymru, the house of Omri, or the northerly kingdom of Israel, and have kept their name even to this day. Their language, of course, shows clear traces. The Welsh is in many respects akin to the Hebrew, and of course the Gaelic of Ireland and Scotland is very close to Hebrew in many respects. There are quite a number of words that are identical in the two languages. Same pronunciation, same meaning. As I say, the tribe of Dan, they were a seafaring tribe from the beginning. As Danes, they remained a seafaring tribe, and they kept the name. They called their land not Denmark, as we call it, Danmark. You look at a Danish postage stamp even today, and it is Danmark. And the mark is a border county. one that has to be defended because there's the enemy on the other side of it. So, that is Dan's mark, or country. Benjamin kept the flag all the way through, the wolf banner. Ephraim and Manasseh, I think there's sufficient evidence to say that at least in portions, England was Manasseh, though, as I told you tonight, look at all the others that got there. And for the rest of them, they got so mixed up. Our first settlement over here, no doubt, was Manasseh. But look who's here now. Every one of the 12 tribes has their representation here, besides a lot of people that are not of the 12 tribes.
This tape was produced by Your Heritage and Pastor Bertrand Comparet. We have much more information in written form and tape recordings, both reel and cassette. We offer this material to assist the personal ministries of those who are called to awaken Yahweh's Israel sheep to the truth of His Word and the necessity for national repentance. Feel free to call upon us for personal consultation. We welcome your suggestions as to how Your Heritage can more effectively spread the gospel of the kingdom. Many people are meeting in their homes using Pastor Comparet's material as a basis for their study. Such groups represent a healthy return to the early assemblies of believers and offers those who finally see the light and come out of the Babylonian church system a place to worship with other believers. We would hope that such meetings would also provide the nucleus of support for a radio broadcast in your area, and we shall be happy to cooperate with you in this regard. As you know, Your Heritage is not associated with any organization. As our congregation, we depend upon your tithes and offerings to pay the expenses of spreading the gospel. We try to merit your support.
Please send all correspondence to our new private zip code, Your Heritage, San Diego, California, 92116-0100. Now goodbye, and may God richly bless you.